Good evening, audience, to this third episode of Polaris Book Reviews. Once again, reviewing a book tonight by one of our own Polaris panelists, Mike Palmer, who has been joining me here from today from Canada. And he'll be talking with me about his book, mRNA Toxicity. It's a quite daunting task, I would say, for anybody that is not medically schooled to read this book and fully grasp all its implications. But we're helping that today by at least letting the author, or at least the main author of the book, speak for himself, asking him directed questions, and we hope that all this audience will take the effort of following the subject because it's quite an important one. That being said, Michael, welcome to this second review of your second book under review here.
Thank you very much, Alexander.
Yes. Well, let me ask just something about the book itself. So I think that's important for the audience to understand why it is written, by whom it is written, and for what purpose it is written. So it's published. Of course, it's freely accessible online, and we'll be posting links. As is your habit, you have been publishing books that are freely accessible, but this one is covered by a group called Doctors for COVID Ethics, and it's a book that's co-authored by a team, we could say, although you are the main author. Explain to me something about what is Doctors for COVID Ethics and who are the team members that you have chosen to write this book with.
So the Doctors for COVID Ethics were a fairly informal group initially. It's still not a very formal one. We came together in the spring of 2021 when the mRNA vaccinations against COVID, also the genetic vaccinations against COVID started in earnest, and mandates were beginning to be imposed left and right. And we felt the need to inform the public about the particular dangers of these newly invented gene-based vaccines. And the initiative came from Europe, actually. There were a bunch of doctors there. One of them was Sucharit Bhakti, who happens to be my former boss. And he and some colleagues had written an open letter to the EMA, to the European Medicines Agency, trying to alert that agency to the reports of severe side effects, including deaths, that were beginning to pour in very shortly after the vaccines had been rolled out in Europe. And so, I think the group that wrote this open letter, I was also one of the participants, that was the nucleus for the still ongoing group of Doctors for COVID Ethics. We held a bunch of online symposia also around the same time during 21 and 22, during the time when the vaccines were particularly widely used, right? I mean, at some point, most people actually realized that it was not necessary and was not a good idea. I think the word of the dangers started to spread underground, even though it was never really acknowledged in the official media or anything. But it's simply a fact of life that vaccine uptake really collapsed more or less in some countries, United States, already during the year 21, and in Europe somewhat later. But after 2022, only very few people actually still went to receive those vaccines. So, in those online symposiums, we also branched out a bit. We discussed why this particular agenda was being imposed, how this medical agenda fit into the wider agenda of political control and this kind of thing. So you can still find the recordings of those online symposiums on our website, d4ce.org. So that is letter D, digit 4, ce.org. Yeah, so that's it. And I mean, for now, right now, we are still holding bi-weekly meetings and having invited speakers and discussing. And now and then we are putting out some video recordings of those presentations and so on. So that is, our activity has diminished somewhat, and also the size of the group has diminished as the focus on COVID has taken a backseat to other agendas that many people perceive as more pressing, I think, than they would perceive COVID as now. Now, regarding the book, I started working on it and collecting collaborators already in 21, but it took me until 2023 to finish it up. So it is an attempt to explain. It focuses mostly on the mRNA vaccines, right? mRNA vaccine toxicity is the title. So, but the other type is second type, not quite as widely used, of gene-based vaccines, which were produced by AstraZeneca and Johnson and Johnson. The adenovirus-based vaccines, they are also touched upon. It turns out that the side effects and the risk mechanisms are really quite similar. There are some subtleties that are different, but these two platforms really have similar flaws and risks. So I really wanted to explain from a perspective of medical science why these vaccines are necessarily dangerous, inherently dangerous. The entire vaccine platform must be considered flawed. And the book makes the case that the evidence which was accumulating during the first few years after vaccinations points fairly clearly to a very general mechanism of damage. It is mostly the immune response to the antigen that are produced within our own body cells after these body cells have taken up the vaccine particles. The immune response is directed, superficially considered, against those antigenic proteins, but at the same time, it really attacks the entire cell that happens to produce this foreign antigen. So that is the key mechanism. And there are also reasons why this mechanism, which one could consider to be shared between these newfangled vaccines and more traditional live virus vaccines, there are clear reasons why this mechanism is much more dangerous in the context of these mRNA vaccines or adenovirus-based vaccines than it is in connection with live virus vaccines. So I wanted to make this understandable from a perspective of medical science. I wanted to present some key evidence that supports this argument. And I think the evidence came in to a large degree. I mean, the most important kind of evidence that really shows this mechanism, right, is the evidence from autopsies or also from biopsies that were taken from patients that were harmed but not killed by the vaccines. And a large part of the evidence in the book comes from the work of now deceased German pathologist Arne Burkhardt, who came out of retirement in 2021 after he had been alerted to the cases of people having died shortly after vaccination. So he took up the task of investigating what had been going on in these patients, with these patients. Good. So that was the purpose of the book, and it is complemented. So that part of the book is mostly done by myself, but there's one chapter on epidemiology, a statistical chapter, and this was done with the help of two people from Children's Health Defense, in particular Brian Hooker, who is the lead scientist at Children's Health Defense. And another chapter that was contributed by another chapter that was contributed by a colleague from sorry, not from Children's Health, from Doctors for COVID Ethics, is that by Mark Skidmore. Mark Skidmore is actually an economist with strong statistical expertise, and he devised a very interesting approach. He carried out a representative survey of people in the United States that addressed the health experiences both after COVID infection and after COVID vaccination. And he managed to devise this survey in such a way that he could extract from the numbers quite specific estimates as to the frequency of severe side effects and death. And he arrived at an estimate for the United States alone, for the year 2021 alone, of between 200,000 and 300,000 people killed by COVID vaccination and a larger number harmed by them. Okay, with respect to the epidemiology chapter, which I briefly mentioned, so there was Brian Hooker of Children's Health Defense and junior colleague Margaret Desbois. They carried out a literature survey. Much of the literature was censored, obviously, in those days, right? It still is today, I think, even nowadays. Many scientific studies that address the problem of COVID vaccine toxicity are being censored, but even from those studies that had made it into the officially peer-reviewed literature, enough evidence could be extracted of the great amount of harm that these vaccines were causing to many organ systems, and in particularly also to fertility. So this is covered in this statistical chapter. Then another very interesting chapter was contributed by Dave Rasnick. David Rasnick is a US scientist, chemist by training, but he worked in biotechnology throughout his career. And he actually, in the 1990s, joined Peter Duesberg, a world-renowned virologist at Berkeley in California. Duesberg had committed the sin of questioning the dogma of AIDS causation, right? He himself is or used to be, he actually recently died this year. But Duesberg was one of the pioneers of retrovirus research. And since the HIV on which the AIDS disease is blamed is from the family of retroviruses, I think he was very competent to judge whether or not this virus was really a plausible candidate to account for the causation of AIDS. And I have since, honestly, I had not been aware of this entire debate, really. I hadn't followed it. I had simply gone along with the dogma of HIV causing AIDS and never really considered it. And I only learned from Dave Rasnick during this COVID fiasco what the score really was on that account. And I have since read some works by Peter Duesberg, and I find his arguments really quite compelling. And David Rasnick, in chapter 9 of the book under discussion here, summarizes the arguments against HIV being the cause of AIDS, and he shows the parallels between the abuse of power in science and more generally in the AIDS pandemic and the more large-scale COVID operation. So I think these chapters round out the entire story really quite well. So it is, to sum up, it is the attempt to show from a scientifically grounded perspective why mRNA vaccines are just a very bad idea, not only in connection with COVID, but more generally. And this idea should never have seen the day of light and should have been abandoned and should have long since been abandoned. I mean, the very fact that we are even now still discussing about the merits of mRNA vaccines, whether they should be tried again, and so on and so forth. After years of accumulating evidence of grave harm, I think shows that something is really seriously wrong in Denmark, so to speak, right? So I wanted to provide the scientific arguments for the case against the vaccines.
Well, of course, the purpose is stated very clearly in the book. The main purpose of this book, you say, was to help solve the following question: what does the COVID-19 mRNA vaccine experience tell us about the safety of future mRNA vaccines? So it's a test case
Yes.
in a certain sense, and I think you did a nice job of also giving a historical perspective by including that chapter that you mentioned, the ninth chapter on AIDS, HIV, because as you also typified in the book, AIDS, HIV controversy was something like what you called a blueprint for the perversion of medical science, and I think it fits in a certain pattern as you propose there as well. Of course, for a non-scientist, the book is not an easy read, and also, of course, it is about a topic that many people would consider at this moment very tiring and very unpleasant, because it has been an episode that has taken a great toll, not only in health but also in energy and in other ways from people. People have lost their jobs, including yourself, because of this vaccine business, this episode. But I think it is very important that we should not forget about it and not just move on, because, as you said, there's of course the danger of repeat, and of course there is, in a certain sense, a very large trail to be followed, a criminal trail, a forensic trail, which we have done in a very scientific way. I would like here to quote a sentence from the foreword written by the president of Children's Health Defense. It gives the reader a little bit of the taste of the direction of the book. So Mary Holland, she writes, anyone alive today may be forgiven for experiencing post-traumatic stress disorder about all things COVID. So she's talking here about the experience I just talked about, is for all of us. The lockdowns, the fear-mongering, the masking, the testing, the censorship, the suppression of effective treatments, the coerced experimental gene-based shots, and the pervasive injuries and deaths that followed it. After 3 years of horror, it is only human to want to put this behind us and forget. Yet this book makes abundantly clear that we would do so at our peril. This undeclared war against humanity is not over, and we must arm ourselves with knowledge. Of course, that's what this book is. It's knowledge. Let me just typify for the reader here. The readers may not have time to read the whole book. They can peruse it online, read chapters of it if they want. But let me just give them a little bit of a clue to what it really is. It's 200 pages approximately of dense scientific writing mostly, including a number of tables, figures, statistics, surveys, pictures of damaged tissue, scientific observations listed in statistical form as well. That all being said, it's a crystal clear, structured book. It is accessible for laymen who take the effort of reading it. And I must say, at times, if you actually go into the material, it reads like a kind of a well-written horror movie script, because the design that becomes apparent here is quite grandiose. It's quite sophisticated. The way this mRNA, specifically the COVID shots, were designed is it was not a small task. It was not a small plan behind this. And it has been laid bare in this book. It has been made to understand. In a certain way, I think Dr. Palmer has managed to reverse engineer a design that has been kept away under all kinds of pretexts, including, of course, copyright and patents. In this reverse engineering allows us to make let's say a forensic investigation of the whole COVID vaccine affair, of course, as far as the mRNA vaccines are concerned. In this respect, I'd like to ask you a question, Michael, and this is, of course, you talk here about kinds of genetically engineered vaccines, so the mRNA proper, and then, of course, as you mentioned, the adenovirus variant. But there have been others. So there was produced in certain countries, like in Iran, in India, and in
Mm,
China,
mhm, mhm, mm.
a
Yeah.
classical virus.
Yes.
So,
Right. Mhm.
can you give your view of those vaccines, which a large part of the world has taken? What
Mm.
have you
Yeah.
looked into them at all?
Yeah, I mean, the data on those are not very abundant in the Western literature, let's say, because they were barely used at all in Western countries. And most of the medical literature comes from Western country even nowadays, right? There were some countries in the West that initially used them. For example, Turkey, if we want to count it as a Western country, but it was then displaced there by the Pfizer vaccine mostly. Same happened in Thailand, for example. Um, Now, the first thing to say is that none of the vaccines, neither these gene-based vaccines nor these traditionally designed vaccines, these dead virus vaccines, inactivated virus vaccines, were necessary. That's the first point, because COVID isn't all that virulent. It's really not much worse than the flu, if at all. And also, there are treatment options. And it is clear from the statistics, it was clear in the spring of 2020, for example, from Italian statistics, that COVID almost exclusively um, killed the elderly, right? The average age of the Italian person killed in the spring of 2020 by COVID, supposedly, was 80 plus years. And it was just simply the same age of death as of the population in general. Okay, so it did not get into a significant degree to the younger population. And this was also echoed, for example, by the chief of Hamburg University forensic medicine, Klaus Pischel at the time, who also says that nobody died of COVID alone. Actually, he got to say this in the newspaper. So in the spring of 2020, there was still a little bit of lucidity left in some newspapers, and he could actually state this out in the open there. But apparently, somebody got to him and put pressure on him, and then he shut up soon. Okay, so now none of the vaccines were necessary. And the second point is none of the vaccines were actually tested sufficiently, right? All these vaccines were developed on short order and they were rushed to market. Okay. Now, but if you, in my view, mistakenly feel the need to rush a vaccine to market, what is the wiser choice? Do you choose a vaccine technology that has been used often before and that in its general features, risks, and benefits is well understood? Or do you bet the farm on something that is completely untested? And you combine this choice of novel experimental technology with a very much abridged testing protocol that doesn't really permit you to carry out any kind of long-term studies, either on efficacy, how long would any protection afforded really last, and on long-term risks. So I think this is a no-brainer, right? I mean, obviously you would choose the tried and true old-fashioned vaccine technology. Another point to note here is, I mean, we are told that mRNA vaccine is really the bee's knees because it can be developed so very quickly, right? Much more quickly than the traditional vaccines. Now, in this connection, it is interesting to note that the first vaccine to actually receive market approval anywhere was actually Sinovac's CoronaVac in China, which was already on the market in August 2020, several months before the mRNA vaccines were approved for the market right, got this emergency authorization by the FDA in the United States and then shortly after by the EMA in Europe. So this is indeed a nonsensical argument because in any vaccine development project, the first step to simply come up with some kind of concoction that has antigenic activity and will induce the formation of antibodies after injection, that's a quick and easy step. This can be done by 2 graduate students, right, who work part-time in the lab. They can manage this in a couple of weeks. then obviously it has to be scaled up somehow, but that's a separate concern. But as far as simply development and testing is concerned, the very first step of producing something that will induce antibody formation, that only takes a very short time, regardless of the choice of the technology. And in particular, for example, this adenovirus vaccine, that would actually be more tricky to develop than either mRNA vaccines or simply an inactivated virus vaccine. What really takes a long time, or should take a long time, but didn't in this case, is the testing of efficacy and safety. These tests need to be carried out very carefully. They should be conducted initially in animal studies. These animal studies should take a number of months, and then there should be a carefully escalated series of clinical trials. Initially, you would only inject a few healthy volunteers, and this is again mostly for safety studies. Then you would right, phase 1 and then phase 2, you would expand it to a somewhat larger group. With drugs, it would be patients of the actual with the actual disease you want to treat. With vaccines, it would again simply be volunteers from the population. And then in phase 3, you would extend it further, both in time and in scale of the trial and so on. But this normally takes years. All right, it takes years with drugs, and it takes years with vaccines. Vaccines actually have been traditionally tested in a somewhat perfunctory and sloppy way. This is probably sort of grandfathering, right? When vaccines were first invented more than 100 years ago, and in those days, the ideas about drug safety, vaccine safety, and so on, they were not quite so developed, and everything was done in a more informal way, and so on and so forth. But in proper drug development, any properly conducted drug development process with all its stages involves several years. And in that context, the short time span that it would take to simply come up with an experimental preparation that can be tested, that is negligible compared to the time the testing would actually take. Okay, so this entire argument is phony. The entire argument that mRNA vaccines are so easy and rapidly to develop is a total phony. It just makes no sense at all. It's completely irrelevant.
Well, I think that the key takeaways from this book, as far as I can make out, is that, of course, on balance, you show and your collaborators show that mRNA vaccines do
Yeah.
damage, and that in this
Mhm.
case, for COVID
Yeah.
19, they
Mhm.
actually constitute a planned effect. The damage is a planned effect, albeit that there is a wide difference in the degree of damage done in between different vaccines and
Mhm.
different batches.
Mhm.
Another key takeaway for me was that the COVID vaccination campaign was not medically motivated. You already brought this up. It was a political
Mhm.
motivated program. And
Yes.
you point to the widespread breakdown in regulatory oversight and the
Oh,
safeguards,
yes.
as well as the
Yes.
misuse of emergency authority. So these are for me the key
Mhm.
three takeaways from this book. And of course, they have large
Mhm.
political implications and large implications for the wider public. Although this book is scientifically oriented, its conclusions definitely have relevance to the wider public, and that should, of course, be politically translated. This concern. Again, I
Right.
quote here from Mary Holland, president of Children's Health Defense. She says, first and foremost, we must accept that we are indeed in our government's crosshairs. Instead of relying on our treacherous and on their treacherous and malevolent guidance, we must watch out for ourselves and for our loved ones, and do our own research and seek out honest health advice wherever it may be found, be it inside or outside the established venues of science and of medicine. Well, here we have a unique case because you, in fact, and your colleagues belong to what would be called properly mainstream medical science, Western science. There's not an alternative about the models you use and the methods you use to understand the workings of these vaccines. So um, this gives also a very big incentive to people that want to um, take up the case of this vaccine rollout, COVID vaccine 19 rollout, to take political action, of course. But this is not a topic that we can discuss here. We'll just go into the book itself. Technical question from my side. I think very crucial is a finding that is on page 182, but it took me a couple of minutes to understand it correctly, and I would like you to translate it into layman's terms, if you can, for our audience. You write on page 182. Overall, the immune-mediated attack on cells that express the antigen encoded by the mRNA vaccine is the leading pathogenic mechanism. I think this is a very crucial sentence. What does that mean? Can you translate it in something easier?
Okay, so several different mechanisms deserve consideration as being potentially responsible for the harmful effect of the vaccines. Okay, and they have all been proposed, and they all have their champions as being the major effects. Right, one of them would be the toxicity of the spike protein. It is indeed proven you can simply purify the surface protein of the COVID virus, of the SARS-CoV-2 virus. You can purify it and you can incubate it with cells, so you can inject it into animals, and you will observe immediate toxic effects. Okay, so it could be that that might be the leading cause of toxicity. If that were the case, if it is indeed this specific protein of this specific virus that is responsible for the harmful effects, then we could assume maybe the results will be better if we take a different protein that is less toxic from a different virus. For example, an influenza virus has different surface proteins. And if we use those as antigens to be expressed after the injection of the corresponding mRNA vaccine, then we might hope for a better outcome. On the other hand, if it is simply the foreign nature, right? I mean, you are aware that the immune system recognizes foreign proteins that are not found normally in the body. Those are picked out by the immune system, and the immune system then mounts various kinds of responses to those foreign antigens. That produces antibodies. That is the most widely known immune mechanism, right? Antibodies are proteins that specifically bind with high affinity to those foreign antigens, to those foreign protein molecules in most cases. And these can then be these complexes, these bound complexes of this foreign antigen with the antibody. They can then be cleared up. They can be taken up and removed and destroyed by so-called phagocytes, right? Macrophages. So that is one aspect of the immune response, but another one, which is probably more important in connection with the mRNA vaccines, is the formation of what is called T killer cells or cytotoxic T cells. These are small immune cells, so-called lymphocytes, that patrol the body. Really, they just circulate throughout the body, often taking a break or just congregating and conferring with each other in the lymph nodes. But they spend time just patrolling through the body and just simply scanning for body cells that expose on their cell surfaces some foreign molecule, some foreign antigen to which the particular T cell in question responds, right? So we
Also, just a
have
moment. So
lots of
that
different variants of these. Yes.
would that include an essentially healthy cell that is coded,
Yeah.
let's say, with foreign particles on the outside, so that it's recognized
Mm.
as foreign, although it isn't, triggering an immune
Yeah.
response. Is that correct?
Right. So yes. No. Okay. So normally, right, this really happens only in virus infections. This is the normal setting, right? If a cell suddenly starts producing proteins that it has not normally produced, it must have taken up some foreign genetic information, and in nature, these are always viruses. So it makes perfect sense for the immune system to take a very harsh line against those cells. They must be suspected of being virus infected. Once a cell has become virus infected, there is no way of knowing when it might stop producing new virus particles and spreading the information. So the only safe bet is to shoot the cell. And this is what these T killer cells do. They shoot the cells which they have identified as being virus infected. Now, what we are doing with these mRNA vaccines, we make our own body cells that take up those vaccine particles to appear to the immune system as if they were virus infected. So therefore, we expose those cells to destruction by the immune system. Okay. And
Yes.
I mean, this is also the case to some degree with live virus vaccines, for example, right? So if you get injected with a smallpox vaccine or with a measles vaccine, some of your body cells near the injection site typically, but also elsewhere, they can take up these attenuated viruses. So these vaccine particles are actually live viruses, but they have been genetically changed so that they are less virulent than the corresponding wild type virus.
So
So, but those,
does that
sorry,
does that al- does that also
but those,
also mean does that also mean that it's very
yes,
important
it does.
that the injection site itself, so that the material affected, the body
Mm,
material affected by the injection, is in one spot only,
mm,
intramuscular.
mhm.
It's very important, right? If this material
Well,
spreads to other
well,
parts of the body.
yes.
Mhm.
Well, but it's not always guaranteed, right? I mean, for example, the smallpox vaccination, it had a considerable frequency of side effects. It was deemed acceptable because smallpox is indeed a fairly dangerous disease, but smallpox vaccination led in a substantial number of cases, for example, also to myocarditis or to brain damage because some of the vaccine virus managed to spread through the body. You have, I mean, also you really don't have tight control, right? So you initially inject into the muscle, and then initially maybe most of these virus particles will be taken up locally. But these cells that take them up will then produce more copies of the virus. Okay. And these additional copies, they can spread throughout the body, right? They won't spread typically quite as aggressively as is the case with the wild type smallpox virus, which really tends to spread everywhere, which is why you have all those lesions all over your skin, not just in the infected side, but all over your body. You have these lesions in the skin and also in anterior organs. Okay. So smallpox affects a large number of body cells and multiple organs and is therefore a dangerous disease. The attenuated virus should, in the typical case, really remain limited to the vaccination site. So most persons only really develop local skin lesions, and that will be it, and it will be sufficient, quite sufficient for inducing immunity. But in some patients, particularly also those with some kind of immunodeficiency and so on, the virus might spread further and induce more widespread damage. So that is a risk with live vaccine viruses also. But nevertheless, most live virus vaccines carry a much lower risk of such severe damage than the mRNA vaccines do. And there's also a clear-cut reason for that. It's a combination of reasons, really. But I mean, one of them is that if you inoculate somebody with a live virus vaccine, the number of particles you inject is really comparatively very small. It's much smaller than it is with the mRNA vaccines. And the reason for that is that to some degree you rely on the immune system, or you rely on the virus initially to spread somewhat, and then the immune system should kick in and shut down the virus infection. Now, if you happen to already be immune to the virus in question or partially immune to the virus in question, then the infection will be shut down very quickly, and only a small number of cells will be ever affected and will be exposed to damage. Now, if you are already immune, for example, to COVID, for example, because of a recent infection. Okay, so you have high titers of COVID antibodies, and you typically will also have some cytotoxic T cells circulating around your system, and you then get injected with an mRNA vaccine. Then these vaccine particles, they have on their surface nothing to tell the immune system what's inside. Okay, with every natural virus has to provide its own delivery vehicle. All right. So if you simply take a naked nucleic acid of some kind and you just simply inject it into someone's body, it will be largely inert. All right. It will have a very hard time to enter any kind of cell and to do any sort of damage. Most of it will simply be destroyed. So every virus must find a way to deliver its viral nucleic acid, be they RNA or DNA, into the body cells in a more effective way. So it must simply produce its own surrounding, its own cage for the nucleic acid to take care of that. So this also means that each virus waves a flag announcing itself. Okay, the immune system can immediately recognize it and shut it down if it already recognizes this as from a previous infection. So you can never really have a head-on collision between strong um, immunity already present and a large amount of viral material in the body. You have either, okay? And the immune system, right, as soon as the immune system ramps up, the virus multiplication goes down. So it's sort of some sort of equilibrium is established there. If you have strong immunity, for example, from a recent infection, COVID infection, and then you get injected with a COVID mRNA vaccine, these the immunity cannot prevent those particles from being taken up by your body cells. But as soon as the vaccine particles are taken up and the production of the spike protein commences, the immune system will respond to that. Okay, so then we will have a head-on collision between a large number of body cells strongly expressing the freshly taken up vaccine and the immediately available immune response, which will then simply attack and destroy those cells. And some of the cases that I illustrate in the book, they really strongly suggest that this is exactly what happened. Some people were injected that had very strong immunity, and they died within a few days. Hours to days, they just died of a hyper acute
Yes.
immune response. There were several such cases, and they are very striking. They're very striking.
I
And
found
this
this
is simply
a
this
very
is
shocking part of your book. In fact, it is
yeah,
like the immune system is triggered
yes,
to fight the body itself. Let me here
yes,
quote a piece of page 43, 44. Your
yeah,
words, while specific immunity mitigates or entirely prevents disease caused by repeated virus infections, it will worsen the harm done by repeated injection of an mRNA vaccine.
that's
Prior
right.
immunity to the antigen encoded in the mRNA vaccine will aggravate the damage caused by repeated exposure to the agent. In keeping with this theoretical prediction, the risk of vaccine-induced myocarditis after the second mRNA vaccine injection reportedly exceeds that after the first one. And actually, you include page 121 showing the incidence of myocarditis for Pfizer and Moderna after the first and the second shot. It's higher after the second shot. That's what we are talking about
Yes,
here. Is that correct?
exactly. Yeah, that's correct, and it's very considerably higher. It's a factor of 5 or something like that order of magnitude. Yeah, it's very considerable. Yes. That is exactly the point. And so that is observed after first and second injection, but the initial uh, injection can have the same effect in a person that has already survived the initial infection with the virus. So in some jurisdictions, people who could prove that they had already acquired natural immunity were not exempted from vaccination. Vaccination was in some jurisdictions forced even onto those people who could prove that they were already immune. And because of the effect that we just discussed, this must really have aggravated the harm done to the general population. That is one of the, I mean, it's a totally brain dead decision. I mean, in no other case would anybody be forced who already has natural immunity to take a vaccine. It is a totally brain dead decision. And this is one of the clues that really lead me to believe that this was all done deliberately. It was on purpose. The purpose was always to damage the health of the people and not to protect it. I mean, that's also the only possible conclusion from the total disregard for the reports of severe harm that were pouring in immediately after the beginning of the vaccinations. I mean, in addition to the public pharmacovigilance systems like vigilance in Europe and various vaccine adverse event reporting system in the United States, the manufacturers, they also are obliged under the law to maintain their own pharmacovigilance. Okay. And Pfizer, they delivered a report, I think to the FDA it was, by the end of February 2021. So this was after 2 months of vaccinations. This report includes a number of more than 1,200 patients killed in connection with the vaccination. And the report also states that the number of reported cases doesn't cover the entire period because there was a backlog, and it is not stated how long the backlog actually is. We have no way of knowing whether this number of 1,200 cases applies to 7 weeks or to 3 weeks of vaccinations, for example. We don't know, right? And the FDA just filed the report and said, okay, fine, go right on delivering your vaccine. I mean, this is just totally unprecedented. There was, I forget now when exactly it was it in the 80s or something? There was a rotavirus vaccine. Rotavirus being one of the viruses causing enteric infections, particularly in small children. And this rotavirus vaccine had caused, if I remember correctly, 19 cases of not even death. It was invagination, or it was intussusception. I mean, there's some special complication from the intestinal tract. Okay, it's life-threatening, but not necessarily deadly. Most patients can be saved. And after 19 such events that had occurred among about 1 million vaccinated children, the vaccine was revoked from the market. Okay. Now we have the Pfizer vaccine, and in a few weeks we have more than 1,000 deaths, and these are the ones that are reported to Pfizer alone. Not everybody reported to Pfizer; others reported to other systems instead, or didn't report at all. So we must assume that the true number of people killed after the time was already in the tens of thousands. Right. That is also consistent with Max Gitmore's estimate of 2 to 300,000 for the entire year 21 in the United States. So everybody who knows these systems and the statistics will be able to figure out what the scale of the disaster really was approximately, but nobody intervened. The government did not intervene. So it is clear, and this was the same pattern everywhere, right? We had really, truly Operation Lockstep throughout the Western world, at least. And the governments all took the same line, all pushing the vaccines, all suppressing all evidence of harm, and so on and so forth. It was really quite clear that this has nothing. It has nothing to do whatsoever with protecting the health of anybody. This was really the very opposite. It was really an onslaught. It was an attack on the health of the people.
Well, you are talking here about the statistical element that is relevant for determining if a vaccine is allowed on the market, if authority is given for its use. And staying with statistics for a moment, there is, of course, the famous former executive of BlackRock, Edward Dowd. He has done some calculations extrapolating from the VARES data and also
Yeah,
from
yeah,
insurance industry data. And
yeah.
he extrapolated, and I'm looking here, end of 2024, that's the time when I stopped following it, a total number of extrapolated deaths worldwide of 17 million, 17. And
Right.
he says that is being followed up with an additional 5,000 deaths per week in the US alone after the end of the vaccination campaign, continuing till now. So, on a year basis, that would be like 250,000 people. Do you think these figures are in any way realistic from your point of view? Sitting in your chair, looking at it from medical evidence point of view, is that possible that it happened like that? That such numbers are
Yes.
involved?
Yes, I think it is quite possible. I mean, the precision is difficult to judge, really, right? I mean, we have really we have very insufficient data. There was also another researcher from Canada, Denis Rancourt. He's actually also now and then joining the meetings at the Doctors for COVID Ethics. He also came up with this estimate of around 17 million that was killed worldwide. That was based on all-cause mortality, on changes in all-cause mortality. He has recently stated that this cannot be substantiated from data, all-cause mortality data, that differentiate people according to the vaccination status. And I must say, I mean, these are government data. I must say, I don't trust those data that contradict these previous estimates, because these all-cause mortality trends are really quite clear. We have also from Denis' own work, he has done extensive studies on all-cause mortality data worldwide. And there are quite remarkable discrepancies in all-cause mortality throughout the year 2020 in particular. So that was the year during which we had the virus but no vaccine. And there are several countries in which there were sudden spikes. I mean, there are no spikes in all-cause mortality that precede the announcement of the pandemic by the WHO, which occurred in March. Okay. Only immediately after the WHO had announced the pandemic did we see spikes in mortality in certain jurisdictions, but not others. We see, for example, a very astonishingly rapid spike of mortality in the state of New York, United States. There is no effect whatsoever to be seen in Texas. Throughout the year 2020, there is no change in mortality relative to the previous years in the state of Texas. Okay, so you see these erratic discrepancies all over the map. So you see it between adjoining states in some cases. You see it, for example, in the Canadian province of Quebec. You see a very high hotspot of increased mortality in Montreal, and nowhere else. You just go outside Montreal and there's just nothing. So I mean, this is not how virus behaves. A dangerous virus would not simply stop at the city limits, or it
What,
would
what you
fail to
what you're
invade
saying here,
Texas.
you are referring here to the virus itself, right? Not to vaccine
Um,
deaths. You're talking about
no,
the early
yes,
stages of the
I
outbreak.
exactly. That's right. Yes, thanks for emphasizing that. Yes, so this is the early stage of the outbreak, and what I'm trying to say here is that the early spikes in mortality had causes that were unrelated to the virus. These were totally dysfunctional and morally decrepit measures, such as taking COVID patients from hospitals and moving them into senior care homes, where they could spread around the virus into the population, this kind of thing, keeping all the doors and windows shut and this kind of thing, allowing no fresh air and so on, and not allowing anybody out into the sun and so on. This is what really caused the mortality. And also these ventilation the protocols. Then they used in several countries, they used midazolam, right, which is known to repress respiration. They used this drug on patients who were already struggling to breathe, right? I mean, they really killed people with these treatment protocols. That was one part of the horror show that was intended to soften up the population for the vaccines. Everybody should panic so that they would all rush to get the vaccines. The next point was all these crazy mandates with masks and social distancing and all this nonsense, closures of public venues and this kind of thing, closing small shops, having large shops open and large store chains open and this kind of thing. It was all completely crazy. So during the year 2020, but there are exceptions. There were, for example, the countries Finland, Estonia, and Japan. Right here we have entire countries that have no spike in mortality throughout the entire year 2020. And some other European countries have some moderate low spike. For example, Holland didn't have very many, Germany didn't have very many. They do have slight bumps here or there. But these three countries I just named, they had low, just average, just typical mortality throughout the year 2020. And then as the vaccine started in 21, mortality went up in all of these three countries. Okay, so all of these three countries, I think they have populations that like to follow the rules, conscientious people, and so on. So I think also the medical profession probably is there. There might be less corrupt than in some other countries. So the people then, they all got their vaccine and only then they started to die. Not before. They started to die when they got the vaccines. And if you look at those trends worldwide, from those trends, you can extract the aforementioned figure of 17 million. And I am not prepared to take any government's word for it, that this is indeed all a fabrication. These numbers are there. They need to be explained. And the most natural explanation is indeed the vaccine rollout. There's no two ways about it. Sometimes you have to choose between two pieces of evidence because they are incompatible. Okay. And the governments, they have told us so many lies. I just don't take any government statistics at face value anymore. Absolutely none.
Well, I remember that in my country, Holland, the people that died within 14
Mm,
days of having received the vaccine, they were
yes.
counted as having died from COVID. That was just a
Yes.
statistical rule.
Yeah. 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 Right. Right. Right.
Surprise, surprise, surprise. There were certain kind of spikes.
Yeah.
But this brings me to
Yes.
a last question that goes into the
Yeah.
more detailed
Yeah.
content of your book and content. And
Yeah.
this is this. You point out that from the adenoviruses, AstraZeneca and
Yeah.
Janssen or Johnson virus, there were
Yeah.
large incidences of myocarditis from the first injection, the first doses of
Yes.
these viruses.
Yes. Right.
They had a large mortality rate. Why is that? Why did they have so much? Because you explained it in the book, but can you explain it for the audience?
Well, why these would have larger incidences than in some cases the mRNA vaccines, I guess that is mostly a matter of dosage. As the striking feature is that with the mRNA vaccines, you have the strongest effect after the second injection, whereas with these virus vaccines, you have stronger effects after the first injection. And the reason for that is that these are still viruses. Okay, so these are virus-like particles, and they contain on the surface not the COVID spike protein, but nevertheless a recognizable viral protein, which will also evoke immunity. Okay, so if you get injected with an AstraZeneca vaccine, you will form antibodies both against the spike and you will form antibodies against the viral proteins, right? The proteins of the adenovirus shell. And those will be recognized during the second injection, after the second injection, and these will then, right, the antibodies against this virus will clear it up and will prevent those particles from effectively reaching the body cells again and inducing in those cells the production of more spike protein. So these are essential, really one-shot vaccines. You can use these vectors only once.
Yes.
Now, there was a third type of these adenovirus vaccines, and it was the Sputnik, right? And this was in Russia. And in the Sputnik vaccine, they actually used two different adenoviruses to be used during the first and second injection, respectively, in order to avoid this very specific effect. And I fear, but I haven't seen any clear statistics. I'm not sure whether they are available anywhere. I fear that Sputnik, that might have just been the worst vaccine of all of them. I wouldn't be surprised if it was, because it combines the badness of the first injection of AstraZeneca and Johnson & Johnson. AstraZeneca in particular had very high rates of cardiovascular complications, of myocarditis, but also of sinus vein thrombosis and so on and so forth. And if you get the same after the second injection with undiminished efficacy because you have a different carrier virus that is not recognized, then the effect might just be particularly bad. And I really can only shake my head in disbelief at the sheer idiocy of putting so much ingenuity into perfecting these poisonous things. It's just beggars belief. It is just crazy. But I must also say, I mean, if from a point of view of planned evil, this was really a fairly brilliant design of a poison, because it is in its effects so unpredictable. It is really very much the luck of the draw, whether you have prior immunity or not, whether the injection goes into the muscle or goes directly, as it will in a few percentage of the population, directly into the bloodstream, and so therefore the entire vaccine dose distributes immediately throughout the body and so on. And then there's also apparent batch-to-batch variation, right? So it is quite clear from statistical studies that some vaccine batches produce a lot more severe side effects than others. To what extent that was intended, or simply a matter of sloppy manufacturing or interrupted cooling chains, it is really hard to tell for certain. I suspect there was an intentional element to it, but it is difficult to prove. But at least there is a very strong batch-to-batch variation. That is quite clear. So it's very much the luck of the draw. Then you have the very wide variation of organ involvement and of symptoms and this kind of thing. So, right, like there is in medicine, there is this term in medical science or in clinical medicine, chameleon of medicine. Okay, so some diseases, they are called chameleons of medicine because they can take all kinds of shapes and they can be very difficult to diagnose, to pin down. And several of those diseases, for example, lupus erythematosus is an autoimmune disease. Okay, these vaccines produce an autoimmune-like disease. It is
Right.
not an autoantigen, but the mechanism of disease is similar to autoimmune diseases. And actually, indeed, genuine autoimmune diseases can be triggered, right, by the intense immune reaction to the vaccine. So what we have here is indeed, if you will, a newly invented, tailor-made chameleon of medicine that strikes in unpredictable ways and unpredictable patterns. And this, I think, contributed to camouflaging the damage. There's always plausible deniability. Oh, this cannot be true, or this is so unusual, and so on and so forth. This contributed to the camouflage. This provided camouflage, plausible deniability. If you simply had taken a good old chemical or bacterial toxin, let's say, if you just simply injected everybody with a certain dose of tetanus toxin, everybody would go into cramps, and so it would be a very characteristic pattern. Now, if you injected everybody with botulinum toxin, everybody would go slack or something like that. Or you injected everybody with cholera toxin, everybody would develop diarrhea. So then the medical profession would pick up on it. It would be simply impossible to deny. But if you have this pattern, not everybody is affected, and those who are infected in a great variety of ways, then it is much easier to deny and to dismiss. And I think this is the evil genius of these vaccines. But nevertheless, it is predictable. There were enough
So,
people who predicted it, and what would happen? There were enough people who predicted what would happen. It is predictable. It is not surprising. It must be expected from first principles of immunology, and that was one of the points I really wanted to make with this book too.
well, plausible deniability you mentioned. Yes, this is what it exactly came across. I'm not a specialist, I'm not a medical person, but I can understand some of the basic tenets of your book, and it came exactly across as that, as a camouflaging mechanism. So the mRNA is actually a delivery mechanism for various forms of death, mainly by autoimmune response.
Yeah.
Let me just mention a few sentences that conclude, or that are conclusions to be drawn from your work in your own words. So, on the medical front, you write, every future mRNA vaccine will induce our cells to produce its own specific antigen related to the particular microbe it targets. We must therefore expect each such vaccine to induce immunological damage on a similar scale as we have witnessed with those directed against COVID-19. I think this is a very clear sentence, a very clear conclusion. People that want to have the arguments for it can just read your book and they will find them. Then there is another conclusion of a more, let's say, sociological or political nature. And this is this. You write, it is not possible to interpret the actions of the authority as honest mistakes. Too much has occurred that points unequivocally to a sinister agenda behind the gene-based COVID-19 vaccines. They rushed approval without necessity. The outright threats and the coercion, the systematic censorship of honest science, and the suppression of truth about the numerous killed and severely injured vaccine victims have all gone on for far too long to permit of any doubts as to intent and purpose. Our governments and the national and international administrative bodies are waging an undeclared war on all of us. This war has been going on for decades and we must expect it to continue and escalate. So let's go a little bit to the larger ramifications of your book. So you're talking about a war that has been going on for decades. I found very interesting the inclusion of chapter 9. So that's about the AIDS and HIV controversy. Most people are not aware of it. I was, because I lived in South Africa in 1994 when Thabo Mbeki became vice president, up till the point that he became president. And he, when he became president, of course, ordered, well, let's say, a critical inquiry. So the chapter 9 goes into that. Without going into too much detail, it does give some kind of clue to what would be made possible later with the COVID pandemic, so called. The AIDS question, the AIDS HIV question, if you look at it from an establishment point of view, so you're part or you were part of the medical establishment, what kind of president was created? Formal president, a procedural president, or an institutional president by this HIV AIDS controversy in the 90s. Can you talk a little bit about that?
I think the president mostly concerns the perversion, the subjugation of medical science as such. I mean, the number of people affected was much smaller. I mean, AIDS patients are much rarer than COVID vaccine exposed people. But the perversion of science is really the key point here. I think this was really an exercise. I think they really practiced how to completely take control of science, how to uh, root out resistance in the field, how to get rid of people. I mean, Peter Duisberg is one who stood up, and therefore his case became quite prominent. He just simply refused to leave and refused to budge. I think he must have been a thorn in the side. Um, but he was an exception. Most other people did shut up, did go away, who were initially critical. And I think that, I mean, I personally entered academia in the around 1990, somewhat slightly earlier than that, slightly before that. And I have seen over the decades that research became more and more subject to government set agendas. Okay. And this is, I think, it's not a coincidence, I guess, that this also was the time in which the 80s and 90s were the time in which the AIDS agenda was enforced, and the dogma was enforced of HIV as the cause of AIDS. So I think that was an important part, right? This perversion of science, this subjugation of science that was practiced during the AIDS so-called pandemic. That became an important aspect of the larger scale operation in the so-called COVID pandemic. I think it was an important part of that.
Well, I think your colleague Rasnik, who wrote this ninth chapter, he put it quite well in words that laymen can understand. He says the AIDS controversy took place originally in 1984. Now, that's of course George Orwell's iconic year. And one of the main
Yeah.
figures of this, one of the main characters of this cast, this movie in 1984, was no less than AIDS Tsar Fauci, Anthony Fauci. So the same man who played a very prominent role in the COVID-19 scam, he also played a very large and
Yes.
prominent role in the AIDS scam. I think
Right.
these two factors in itself already make me think that something is profoundly wrong with the, let's say, the mainstream story of AIDS, HIV. But in any case,
Yeah. Yes.
another
Yeah.
question I wanted to ask you. Of course, you are a medical doctor yourself. You have dedicated your life to medical science to a large degree, and I wonder how does the experience of this COVID-19 pandemic, however you want to call it, how does it affect you? I here see something that your colleague, Catherine Fitz, writes about medical dissidents. She writes, some of them, dissidents, have now lost positions and titles. She's talking about medical professionals. They have lost income, they have lost benefit packages, they have worked without compensation for countless hours, they have been targeted by media slander, disinformation. Some have been the target of baseless investigations, lawsuits, and persecution. Some have lost medical licenses, some have lost homes, families, and friends. I believe that some have been poisoned and even assassinated. And all have experienced a profound grief and frustration when friends and families who would not heed their warnings fell sick and died. So this is her perspective. What's your perspective? So as a medical professional, if you look at this experience, what impact did it have on you personally, professionally?
Well, overall, I think it was a liberating effect. it was, to me, it was a liberating effect. I mean, I increasingly felt uncomfortable with the environment in academia over the years. I was actually, I mean, yes, I did study medicine, but I spent my life in research in first microbiology and then later on in biochemistry. So I was really somewhat removed from clinical medicine. Um, but I think regardless of where in academia you were, I think it's even outside the so-called exact sciences, it probably felt somewhat similar. I mean, the entire environment got increasingly bent out of shape. People were co-opted into that system who were clearly not qualified, or whose qualifications simply amounted to uh, subscribing to politically approved agendas, for example, in the sciences, to climate change, human-made climate change, and this kind of nonsense. Um, and with the advent of the so-called COVID pandemic and the experience that nobody or almost nobody could see it for what it was, it gave me a clear understanding that indeed my vague feeling that academia had gone off the rails was profoundly correct. And this was liberating for me. So I really could simply stop worrying about what this environment, to what extent I was able to succeed in this environment or not, and to conform to this environment. Obviously, there was no value in conforming. There was no value in succeeding and being rewarded within this kind of perverted system. So it was liberating in the way that I simply started speaking mind about everything and just simply laying out my case, as for example in this book, laying out my arguments as best I could, simply based on traditional concepts of science. I think I personally would have been quite comfortable in the science of the late 19th century, for example. I think there you had an actually honest, open, robust debate, also controversy, also some stubbornness here and there. But I think the entire system was much more open. Ideas where you could have clear controversies, you could have clear competition, whatever. But for example, if you look back at the discoveries of Robert Koch, a much maligned person nowadays, but if you look back at his work was robustly criticized by his contemporaries. But this criticism really shows that everybody was serious about the scientific questions. I would have loved to actually be able to live and work, even play a minor role in that sort of environment than what academia has become nowadays. Academia has become completely corrupted, debased, and it is really no fun, and there is no merit in trying to join and succeed, to join the system and succeed in it.
I
So
think it's
I was liberated from that perverted environment. It kicked me out, and that was a good thing for me.
Well, I think it has this experience of the COVID-19 has kicked many people, even ordinary people, out of their comfort zones, to the good or to the
Mhm.
bad, to whatever effect.
Yeah.
The view of humanity that I was left with was quite altered by COVID-19. Let's
Yes.
recall another data point from your book. No less than 13 billion doses of COVID vaccine have been distributed and administered worldwide. The effects, of course, continuing on for many years, including into DNA. So the DNA of the human, that also people can read about in this book. In any case, your colleague Rasnik, again, chapter 9, he also talks about the view that he had looking back on this COVID 19 and looking back on the HIV controversy. He said, since World War II, and especially in recent decades, the stifling of debate and the persecution of dissenters has become entrenched in virtually every major field of science in the US. It is particularly virulent in the so-called biomedical sciences. The conjoining of government, big business, and academia, which President Eisenhower warned about in 1961, now rules the world. COVID-19 fraud is the AIDS scam writ large. We are in the middle of a global totalitarian takeover, and things are going to get much worse. That's what he writes. So, my final question
Yes.
to you, Michael, it is Lenin's famous question: what is to be done? I mean, your colleague Catherine Fitz on the final page, she writes the certainty that the mRNA technology kills and maims, and that this was known by those who made and released the COVID-19 vaccinations with priceless intelligence. That's her final takeaway. But what do you think is to be done with all this information that you have uncovered in this book and you have laid out in front of people? What should people do with it?
Well, they should steadfastly refuse to be injected with this kind of poison again, and they should also refuse to be scared into doing these kinds of things. I mean, we have seen the lies that were used and that were told in order to coerce people into these vaccinations, right? I mean, the most absurd one of them was the so-called pandemic of the unvaccinated, right? Just stop and think for a moment. So what this presupposes is that a vaccinated person can still be infected, but he can no longer transmit the infection. This is completely absurd. This has never occurred with any kind of microbe before. You can a person who is, I mean, every microbe is transmitted by those people who are infected with it, right? So you either are infected, then you are infectious, or a vaccine can only prevent transmission to the degree it prevents infection. So the entire idea of vaccinated people who are themselves unprotected, but are nevertheless able to protect others by the
Mhm.
act of being vaccinated, it's completely absurd. This is absurdity defined. So, and even this stupid story was just shouted from all pulpits throughout the Western world, at least. So we must simply stop being scared of them. Stop being scared of the other side. Rely on our own wits, and just stop believing in authority. And just simply use our own minds, rely on our own judgment, talk to each other in order to sort things out, and simply stop being obedient followers of orders that are handed down from clearly malevolent governments. We must simply practice civil disobedience. Must get better at that, I think.
Well, I think here you put a proper point that has been made by many dissenters who are not medical specialists, but who have similar conclusions. By looking at the evidence and by using their own brain, a very prominent figure in this regard is Irish journalist John Waters, who has played a prominent role criticizing the COVID campaign in Europe, as well as Matthias Desmet from Belgium, who has
Mhm.
drawn his sociological and psychological conclusions from what actually made this so-called pandemic possible, namely the social and psychological conditions underlying it. But that's a whole other topic. I think we
Right.
can conclude this interview by saying that this book is something like a reverse engineer manual for scientists who, by this book, can prove what went wrong, why it went wrong, and why these mRNA vaccines are not a good idea. And also, it gives people, readers, the general public, a measure of protection, I would say. It immunizes them by simply putting on their side a weight of evidence that they can point to for whatever purpose they see fit, including legal purposes. That all being said, Michael, I would like to thank you for this podcast, this book review, and for your effort in writing this book.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you very much for the opportunity to explain it. Thank you.
Thank you, and also thanks to our audience. Thank you for paying attention to this very important matter, the consequences of which will be with us for many years, and the form and shape of which can be repeated. We are warned. This book is a warning, and it's important for people to take notice. Thank you for your attention to this matter, and goodbye.